At a general level, that's fairly easy to answer. Our expectations are the expectations that are contained in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We don't intend to bring expectations that go beyond what's contained in the UN Guiding Principles, and of course we're very concerned also not to undercut and to express lower expectations than those guiding principles. But in fact, even the Commission's official policy document, the communication that the Commission adopted in 2011, says very clearly, word for word, that the European Commission expects all enterprises to meet the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as defined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. One of the important reasons for basing our expectations on that global instrument is it allows us all to work towards a situation in which the expectations on all businesses everywhere, all around the world, are broadly similar. We don't want to fall into the trap of unnecessarily placing much higher expectations or much higher standards of behaviour on European companies that one couldn't also legitimately expect of other companies around the world. We've taken the UN Guiding Principles and we've run two parallel processes, essentially. One, looking at smaller businesses, at SMEs, and trying to take the UN Guiding Principles and put it in a language, in a format that makes it more accessible and more relevant to a certain extent to small and medium-sized enterprises. And we've published that recently in, I think, nearly 30 different languages, including all official EU languages, but quite a lot of non-EU languages as well. And the other part of the parallel process is to translate those UN Guiding Principles into practical guidance for companies in three business sectors: employment and recruitment agencies, ICT, telecoms companies, and oil and gas companies. In each case, we're not coming with new EU guidelines or principles. The guidelines and principles are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. What we're trying to do is to develop a guide for the person or people in individual companies whose task it is to get that company to implement the UN Guiding Principles, and to take them by the hand and show them what the issues are, indicate what other companies have done, indicate what other important reference resources might exist. It's not designed to be prescriptive, it's practical, non-legally binding guidance that we hope will help companies to move forward and better implement the UN Guiding Principles. The SME guidance, as I mentioned, is already public. The sector guidance, all being well, will be published during the course of May. I think one very important point to make at the beginning is that there is a very large amount of legislation and other policies at EU level, at national level in the EU and elsewhere in the world that has the effect of protecting human rights. Think of health and safety legislation, a lot of environmental legislation, a lot of labour law, obviously. Most of it probably doesn't refer explicitly to human rights, but that's not the point. The point is that a lot of existing legislation has the effect of, if we put it in the language of the UN Guiding Principles, it has the effect of meeting the state duty to protect human rights. And that's important to point out because we don't start from zero. Exactly the same way that 99% of enterprises don't start from zero. Why? Because they have health and safety policies, or they do certain things to make sure that they behave, generally speaking, correctly, even if they haven't put it in the terminology of human rights. And exactly the same thing applies on the side of states and by extension, to a certain extent, to the European Union. But having said that, what are the things that one could sort of point out as of today that are happening, that have a particular relevance to the implementation of these UN Guiding Principles? We've mentioned the guidance. Another important thing that we have done is invite EU member states to put together their own national plans for the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles. And a number of different member states are starting to do that, which is something that we welcome very much. We also try to address the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights more systematically, I wouldn't yet say systematically, but more systematically in dialogues that we have with different partner countries and regions around the world, which again gradually begins to help raise awareness and ensure that, broadly speaking, across the globe there are initiatives to implement these guiding principles. You mentioned the non-financial disclosure issue. As you know, the European Commission has said that it will present a legislative proposal on the non-financial information that companies may be required to disclose. It's hard to know until we see the final Commission proposal the extent to which that is directly relevant to the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, because it will depend on the content of that legislative proposal and on the way it's drafted. But it seems likely that the Commission may well adopt that proposal relatively soon, and when it's published we'll be better able to judge its relationship with the UN Guiding Principles. Other things worth mentioning, the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade has recently published a public consultation on, broadly speaking, the issue of conflict minerals, to see whether there needs to be an EU policy initiative in that field, and if so, what form it might take. And clearly that again could be in quite a specialised particular way, but it could be quite relevant to the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights. If you talk about this broad range of EU policies, EU development aid is obviously very relevant. That doesn't mean that you'll find lots of individual aid programs financed by the EU that says this is implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But if you go, for instance, to Bangladesh, you'll find that there are individual EU-funded projects on factory safety and on labour standards in the textile industry and so on. One of the other important things that we can do and do is engage with other organisations, whether they be international organisations or organisations like yours. The development of the criteria that you have put together regarding operational level grievance mechanisms is for us that's something very valuable, and it's good, we think, for us to be able to engage with you in dialogue about how that can best be done, and help perhaps to some extent also to bring the attention of others to the work that you are doing. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I would call it the compliance side of CSR, but I understand what you mean. I mean, clearly enterprises can and do have positive impacts on the realisation of human rights through all